The Oregon wilderness at the turn of the century was the kind of place that could swallow sound and secrets whole. Towering pines rose like ancient sentinels, their branches so thick that daylight rarely touched the forest floor. Beneath that green canopy, a lonely dirt road wound its way through miles of silence, ending at a house that didn't belong there. They called it the Oats property, 200 acres of timberland and shadow, ruled by a man named Waldo Oats, a hardworking sawmill owner with a reputation for privacy. His wife had died giving birth to twins, Phoebe and Wilbert, in 1884, and from that moment, the house fell under a kind of quiet spell. The few neighbors who ever visited described it as too still, as if the place itself were holding its breath. Waldo raised his children alone, his life defined by work and grief. The twins grew up pale and ghostly, their hair almost white, their eyes the color of glacial water. They rarely spoke in town, and when they did, it was often together, one beginning a sentence, the other finishing it. People whispered that they shared one mind, two bodies. As the years passed, the family withdrew deeper into isolation. By the mid-1890s, after a cruel incident in town where the twins were mocked for their eerie appearance, Waldo stopped taking them anywhere at all. The forest became their world, the sawmill their only connection to civilization. It was around then that the strangeness began to take root. Visitors reported seeing candlelight flickering through the attic windows late into the night. Others claimed to hear faint laughter, two voices, identical in pitch, echoing from somewhere high above the treetops. When questioned, Waldo brushed it off as childish imagination. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The twins no longer played like ordinary children. They preferred to sit in silence, facing each other for hours, communicating through glances no one else could interpret. There's a particular kind of loneliness that seeps into people who live cut off from the world. It doesn't just make them quiet, it changes the rhythm of their thoughts. By the time Phoebe and Wilbert reached adulthood, that loneliness had become something else entirely. In the spring of 1902, Waldo began noticing things that made his stomach tighten. The twins spent long hours in the attic, whispering. They'd stopped using separate rooms. And sometimes, when he walked in unexpectedly, they'd turn toward him with the slow, synchronized grace of reflections in a mirror. Still, Waldo said nothing. Maybe he didn't want to believe it. Maybe he thought silence could stop whatever was growing inside that house. But silence in the Oregon woods has a... By winter's first snow in 1902, the Oats family was completely cut off from the outside world. The narrow mountain road vanished beneath a thick white blanket, and for nearly 3 months, no one came in or out. It was during that frozen isolation that the twins' fascination deepened. Phoebe and Wilbert spent day after day buried in their late grandfather's library, a collection of old texts on genealogy, hereditary traits, and the idea of pure bloodlines. They treated those dusty volumes like scripture. Somewhere between those brittle pages, an idea began to form, one that blurred every line between curiosity and delusion. Waldo heard them talking once, through the crack under the attic door. Their voices were calm, almost scholarly, as they spoke about continuity, about preserving the essence of the family. He didn't understand what they meant, but it chilled him anyway. When the snow finally melted and spring returned, the Oats property looked the same from the outside. Tall pines, smoke from the chimney, the soft hum of saws from the mill. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The twins moved with a quiet confidence, as if they shared a secret Waldo wasn't meant to know. And he didn't, not yet. The last normal moment came one April morning when Waldo rode into town for supplies. The general store's owner, a man named Cole, smiled and asked him how the wedding plans were coming along. Waldo froze. "What wedding?" he asked. Cole frowned. "Well, your daughter was here a few weeks back. Said she was preparing for a ceremony. Bought white fabric and candles. I figured you'd be the proud father of the bride." Waldo didn't respond. He just stood there, jaw clenched, staring past the man like he hadn't heard him right. By the time he rode home, the afternoon sky had turned the color of iron. His horse kicked up dirt as he neared the house, heart pounding faster with every step. Inside, Phoebe and Wilbert were sitting side by side in the parlor, hands intertwined, eyes bright with a calm he couldn't understand. And when they told him what they decided, what kind of wedding it would be, something in Waldo's soul cracked. The forest outside was utterly still that evening, as if even the wind refused to bear witness. There are some silences that feel peaceful, like the hush after a snowfall. And then there are silences that feel alive. The kind that watches you, listens back. That's what the Oats house became after that night. Waldo couldn't bring himself to speak of what he'd heard. The twins' calm declaration that they intended to marry each other echoed in his head like a fever dream. He tried to convince himself it was madness, youthful confusion twisted by isolation. But when he looked at them, sitting so close their shoulders touched, he saw no shame, only conviction. Phoebe and Wilbert believed, truly believed, that their bond was sacred. They called it the unbroken circle. To them, it wasn't defiance, it was destiny. At first, Waldo raged. He shouted scripture, threatened to throw them out, even begged them to think of their mother's memory. But they just stared back with those pale, glacier blue eyes, eerily calm. And when they finally spoke, it wasn't in anger, it was in perfect harmony. "You don't understand, Father," Phoebe whispered. "It's not against nature," Wilbert finished. "It is nature." After that, something shifted in the house. Waldo withdrew, drinking more than before, losing himself in the noise of his sawmill. He stopped trying to reason with them. Maybe he thought ignoring it would make it fade away. But the twins only grew closer, moving through the house like two halves of one shadow. They had their own rhythm, their own private language made of glances and subtle movements. One would tilt their head slightly, and the other would nod. A soft sigh from Phoebe could make Wilbert stop mid-step, as if he knew exactly what she meant without a word spoken. Visitors who dared approach the property, traders, deliverymen, the rare neighbor, spoke of the unsettling coordination between them. It wasn't just closeness, it was something else. Something inhumanly synchronized. And then came the books. Old journals and anatomy sketches appeared on their table. Notes filled with family trees, heredity patterns, strange theories about refinement of bloodlines. They spoke openly about lineage, about creating something pure. Waldo didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the same obsessive tone his own father had once used when talking about building an empire, only now that ambition had turned inward, aimed at the flesh and blood of their own line. The day of the ceremony came quietly. No pastor, no guests, just a gray Oregon morning and a field of wet grass behind the house. Waldo stood there trembling, forced into the role of witness. The twins held hands beneath the pine trees, speaking vows they'd written themselves. Their voices overlapped perfectly, blending into one. There were no rings, just a single silver thread they tied between their wrists. And when the last word fell into the silence, a crow cawed somewhere in the forest, as if punctuating the unthinkable. From that moment, the Oats twins weren't just brother and sister. They were husband and wife. And that house, already strange, became something else entirely. The forest was quiet that morning, too quiet, as if nature itself refused to bear witness. A gray mist clung to the trees, muffling sound, swallowing color. Even the birds stayed hidden, silent in their nests. Phoebe had dressed herself in white, not the crisp white of a wedding gown, but the soft, ghostly white of linen she'd hand-dyed herself. Her hair was braided with threads of silver twine. Wilbert stood beside her, wearing his father's old Sunday coat, the sleeves a little too short. And Waldo, he stood a few steps away, frozen, holding the family Bible with trembling hands. He hadn't agreed to the ceremony. He'd simply been told it would happen. His presence wasn't blessing. It was obligation. Witness. Prisoner. The twins spoke in low, overlapping voices. Their words weren't the vows of ordinary lovers. They sounded more like a pact. "Two born together," Phoebe whispered. "To remain together," Wilbert answered. "Unbroken. Unseparated. Forever." When the final words faded, Wilbert cut a small lock of his hair and tied it around Phoebe's wrist. She did the same. No rings. No priest. Just the sound of the wind brushing through pine needles and Waldo's shallow breathing as he realized what he was witnessing would never be undone. From that day on, the Oats home began to change. Waldo moved out of the main bedroom, retreating to a smaller room near the mill. He couldn't bear to sleep under the same roof, yet couldn't bring himself to abandon his children entirely. Maybe some part of him believed it was just a phase, that eventually reason would return. But it never did. Phoebe and Wilbert began living like a couple, sharing meals, whispering in corners, locking doors. At night, Waldo sometimes heard footsteps above him, slow and rhythmic, like a ritual. Sometimes laughter. Sometimes nothing at all. He took to leaving before dawn and returning after dark, just to avoid them. The sawmill became his refuge, its constant groan drowning out the whispers that crept from the house. But even there, he couldn't escape. The forest carried sound in strange ways. On still days, he swore he could hear them calling to each other from the open windows, softly, almost lovingly. Then came the preparations. The twins began buying supplies in town: candles, planks, jars, fabric, rope. They boarded up windows, built locks onto every door, and dug something in the basement. When asked, Phoebe said simply, "We're preparing for the future." The neighbors thought it strange, but kept their distance. After all, the Oats property had always been a place where outsiders weren't welcome. By autumn, Phoebe's health began to change. She grew paler, more fragile. Wilbert followed her everywhere. When Waldo finally realized what was happening, he nearly collapsed. His daughter was pregnant. And with that, the Oats family crossed the point of no return. The forest around them held its breath once again. Something had been conceived, not just a child, but a legacy of darkness. The storm came the same night Phoebe went into labor. It was March of 1904, and thunder rolled through the mountains like cannon fire, rattling every loose nail in the Oats house. Waldo woke to the sound of his daughter's screams echoing through the hallway, but when he tried to rush upstairs, Wilbert blocked the door. "Stay out," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry, just cold. Final. For hours, Waldo paced the floor below, gripping his Bible with shaking hands. Each scream tore through him like a blade, followed by silence that was even worse. When at last the crying began, the thin, fragile cry of a newborn, relief washed over him. But when Wilbert finally opened the door, that relief curdled into horror. The baby girl was small, too small, her skull oddly shaped, her fingers 6 instead of 5. Yet Phoebe cradled her like a miracle. Wilbert stood beside her, smiling faintly, as if their daughter's deformities were proof that destiny had blessed them. "She's perfect," Phoebe murmured. "Exactly as she should be." Waldo turned away, bawl rising in his throat. He'd seen enough births in his life to know when something wasn't right, and this, whatever it was, wasn't right. But his words died in his mouth. The twins' serenity was terrifying. It was as if they'd expected this, planned it. In the months that followed, Waldo rarely saw the baby. The twins kept her locked away upstairs, claiming she needed protection. When he asked about her health, they smiled politely and changed the subject.
Soon he stopped asking.
The air in that house had grown heavy with a kind of quiet threat. By the end of the year, Phoebe was pregnant again. This time, she didn't hide it. She moved through the house like a queen, her hand resting proudly on her belly, Wilbert hovering nearby with the anxious devotion of a priest guarding a sacred relic. They wrote constantly in notebooks, measurements, observations, diagrams. When Waldo once glimpsed a page, he saw words that froze him where he stood. Correction through variation. That winter, he began hearing strange noises from the basement. Soft crying. The scrape of something heavy being moved. When he confronted Wilbert, his son simply smiled. "The wind," he said. "You know how it plays tricks." The second child, a boy, was born that December, during a snowstorm that buried the property for days. This time, no cries echoed through the halls. When Waldo finally saw the baby, he was shocked by how normal he looked.
healthy, whole.
But instead of joy, the twins seemed disappointed. The experiment must continue, Wilbert whispered one night, his voice drifting through the floorboards. Perfection takes time. Waldo realized then that his children no longer saw what they were doing as sin, or even family. They saw themselves as creators. And the Oats house, once a home, had become a laboratory. Somewhere beneath that timber roof, humanity was being quietly rewritten. By the winter of 1905, word had begun to spread through the Crater Lake region, whispers of strange lights at night, smoke rising from the Oats chimney long after midnight, and faint, echoing cries that carried through the trees. Most people dismissed it as superstition. But one man didn't. Homer Mixon was a seasoned hunter, the kind of man who trusted his instincts more than any rumor. He'd fought in frontier skirmishes, tracked cougars through snow, and survived storms that had killed lesser men. When he heard the stories, curiosity pulled him toward the Oats property like a magnet. He told himself he was just checking in, making sure everything was all right. But deep down, he already knew something wasn't. The first time Homer approached the house, he noticed how still everything was. No dogs barking, no laughter, not even the usual rhythm of a sawmill in motion. Just that unnatural silence. When Wilbert finally opened the door, his smile was polite. Too polite. Phoebe appeared a moment later, her expression equally calm. They invited Homer in for coffee, speaking about the weather as if nothing in the world were wrong. But Homer couldn't ignore what he saw. The windows had been boarded from the inside. The wallpaper was yellowed with damp, the air thick with a faint antiseptic smell, something sharp, chemical, as though the house were half clinic, half tomb. And there were no sounds of children. He asked about them casually. "Heard you've got little ones now. Must be lively in here." Phoebe's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flickered toward the staircase. "They're sleeping," she said softly. "Middle of the day?" Homer asked, half joking. Neither twin answered. When he excused himself to find the bathroom, Homer took the chance to explore. The hallway was dim, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Then he heard it, a muffled cry, faint but unmistakable, rising from beneath his feet. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house. It was a child. He froze, heart pounding. The sound lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. When he returned to the living room, the twins were watching him. Both of them, perfectly still, identical smiles carved across their faces. "Everything all right?" Wilbert asked, his tone pleasant but heavy with subtext. "Fine," Homer lied. "Just a draft down the hall. Thought I heard something." Their smiles vanished in unison. "The wind," Phoebe said softly. "It plays tricks this time of year." Homer left soon after, claiming he had traps to check before nightfall. But as he rode away through the pines, he couldn't shake the feeling that the air itself was following him, thick, watchful, waiting. That night, he made a decision. He would come back. Quietly. Whatever was happening in that house, he intended to see it for himself. He should have never gone back. Because the next time Homer Mixon entered the Oats property, he never came out again. The night Homer Mixon returned to the Oats property, the forest was soaked in fog thick enough to blur the moon. The hunter moved with the silence of a shadow, his rifle slung across his back, every step deliberate. He wasn't hunting deer this time, he was hunting answers. He crept along the tree line until the outline of the Oats house appeared between the pines. From a distance it looked abandoned, no lights, no movement. But Homer knew better. The Oats twins had a habit of coming alive when the rest of the world slept. He waited until the lanterns flickered on inside, faint through boarded windows. Then slowly he moved closer. Near the back of the house, a small basement window sat half-covered by dirt and leaves. Through its narrow gap, Homer could see movement, shadows passing before the light of a single lamp. He crouched low, holding his breath. At first, he thought they were tending to animals. The shapes were small, shifting in confined spaces. Then came the sounds, soft whimpers, the kind no creature of the woods could make. The hairs on his neck stood up. He realized with a cold, creeping certainty that these weren't animals at all. They were children. He pressed closer to the glass. Inside, Phoebe and Wilbert moved in eerie synchronization, carrying bowls of food and small blankets between a series of wooden enclosures. Each enclosure had a tiny opening, just enough to pass something through. From one came a faint sob. From another, a slow rhythmic tapping, like a lullaby without words. Phoebe leaned close to one of the cages and whispered something. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Homer's stomach twisted. He'd seen cruelty before, wars, hunger, death, but this was different. This was methodical, controlled. He had to tell someone. As he turned to leave, the earth shifted beneath his boots. A branch snapped. The sound, small as it was, cut through the night like a gunshot. The lantern light inside flickered. Wilbert stopped moving. His head turned toward the window, slowly, unnaturally, as though he already knew someone was watching. Homer froze, heart hammering in his throat. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then the lamp went out. Darkness swallowed everything. He stumbled backward into the fog, trying to keep quiet, but the forest seemed alive with noise now, rustling branches, soft crunches behind him that didn't belong to his own feet. He turned once, certain he saw two shapes standing at the edge of the trees, side by side. That was the last anyone ever saw of Homer Mixon. Days later, searchers found his rifle leaning against a pine trunk a mile from the property. His footprints ended just beyond it. No sign of struggle. No sign of blood. Just gone. And from that day on, the locals said that on foggy nights, if you stood near the old Oats land, you could still hear something faint. A low, rhythmic tapping, echoing up from beneath the earth. After Homer Mixon vanished, the people of Crater Lake didn't ask too many questions. Out here, men disappeared all the time, into rivers, snowstorms, or the jaws of mountain lions. But something about this one felt different. Homer wasn't the kind of man to simply vanish. Within weeks, the Oats property became a shadow in local conversation. Hunters began avoiding the ridge altogether. Even the bravest lumberjacks refused to take timber from those woods. They said the air around the property had changed, that it carried a faint metallic taste, like old blood and smoke. Inside the house, Waldo Oats was unraveling. He was thinner now, pale as the wood dust that covered his clothes. Nights brought no rest, only nightmares of muffled cries from beneath the floorboards. When he tried to pray, the words came out hollow. When he tried to confront the twins, they smiled and told him he was hearing things. But Waldo knew the sound of a child's cry. He'd heard it too many times before. He started drinking from morning till night, anything to dull the noise. His once proud sawmill stood still, swallowed by weeds. The man who had once dreamed of an empire now wandered his land like a ghost, muttering to himself about sins that grew in the dark. Meanwhile, Phoebe and Wilbert thrived in their isolation. Their home had become a fortress, windows sealed, doors locked, basement expanded. They moved like two parts of a single mind, whispering in that eerie shorthand of theirs. No one knew what they said, but whatever it was, it bound them tighter than any ring. In the town below, Dr. Clarence Benson began taking notice. He'd treated the Oats family years earlier, back when Phoebe was still a shy, quiet girl. But the recent rumors unsettled him, especially after a merchant confided that the twins had been buying strange supplies: lime, rope, medical alcohol, and books on human heredity. Then came another report: a shepherd found wandering the woods, terrified and disoriented. He claimed he'd heard voices in the basement, voices of children who shouldn't exist. No one believed him, except Benson. He started keeping notes, following the Oats' purchases, their visitors, their movements. But each time he planned a visit, something in him hesitated. There's an instinct all people share, a primal warning that whispers don't go there. Benson ignored it until it was too late. In early 1908, he packed a small medical bag, telling colleagues he intended to check on a family in distress. He was last seen riding his horse toward the Oats property under a pale, cold moon. 3 days later, the horse returned alone. The saddle was torn. The reins were slick with blood. That was when silence truly took hold of Crater Lake. No one spoke of the Oats twins anymore, not out of disbelief, but out of fear that speaking their names might somehow wake them. And in the mountains, the Oats house stood patient, breathing softly in the dark. Because inside those walls, silence had become its own language. And every whisper meant something terrible. By 1913, the Oats property had become more rumor than reality, an unspoken scar on the map of Crater Lake. No one went near it unless they had to. Even the animals seemed to avoid that stretch of forest. But Sheriff Schuyler Tucker didn't have the luxury of superstition. He'd ignored the whispers for years. Tales of strange lights, missing travelers, the old hunter who never came home. But when Dr. Benson vanished, the pressure became too great. Letters from Portland had started piling up, all asking the same question: what happened to those men? So, on a fog-choked March morning, Tucker rode up the mountain with 2 deputies and a county clerk. None of them spoke during the long, winding climb. The silence was heavy, almost physical. When the Oats house finally appeared through the mist, it looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Its walls were warped by years of rain, the windows sealed shut with boards and iron latches. The chimney smoked faintly, proof that something or someone still lived inside. The twins were waiting for them on the porch. Phoebe's hair was pinned neatly, her dress spotless despite the mud. Wilbert stood beside her, his expression calm, almost welcoming. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, as though one body obeyed 2 minds. When Sheriff Tucker handed them the search warrant, they didn't resist. They simply exchanged a glance, smiled, and said, "We've been expecting you." The search began upstairs. What they found first was the notebooks, dozens of them, handwritten in identical script, filled with anatomical drawings, measurements, and notes labeled specimen 1 through 6. Some pages documented feeding times. Others detailed experiments, sensory deprivation, light exposure, responses to confinement. Then came the small, locked rooms. Behind the first door, they found a child, 9 years old at most, frail and disfigured, her limbs twisted unnaturally. She recoiled from the light, making a sound that wasn't quite human. Phoebe calmly explained that the girl was special and had to be protected from herself. Wilbert nodded along, his face expressionless. In the next room was a boy, slightly older, sitting motionless on the floor, his eyes blank. He didn't react to voices, only rocked back and forth in silence. By the time they reached the basement door, even the deputies were trembling. The air in the hallway had changed. It was thick, sour, alive with the smell of decay. Tucker turned the handle.
Locked.
"Open it," he ordered. Wilbert hesitated only for a moment before producing a heavy iron key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo for miles. The door groaned. The smell hit them first, then the sound, soft, rhythmic breathing from the dark below. Lanterns swayed as they descended the stairs. And what they saw down there would haunt Oregon forever. The moment Sheriff Tucker's boots hit the basement floor, the light from his lantern trembled, and so did his hands. The space beneath the Oats house wasn't a basement anymore. It was a maze of narrow rooms, each crudely built, each sealed with thick wooden doors fitted with tiny barred openings. The first door opened to reveal a boy of about 8. He crouched in the corner, rocking, eyes dull and unfocused. The next door creaked open to a small girl, skin paper-thin, wrists raw from rope burns. She flinched at every movement, every sound. The smell of rot and waste clung to the air. But it was the third room that broke the deputies. Inside, beneath a mound of filthy straw, lay a child's body, small, twisted, long dead. The walls were scratched over and over again, as if little hands had tried to claw their way out. Tucker staggered back, covering his mouth. When he turned on the twins, they didn't deny a thing. "Not all subjects survive," Wilbert said evenly. "That's the nature of observation." Phoebe added softly, "Death teaches more than life sometimes." Their calmness was worse than any confession. In another corner of the basement, Tucker found personal items belonging to both Homer Mixon and Dr. Benson, alongside notes describing how they'd been neutralized. The twins had documented everything: methods, timing, observations. It was a murder to them, it was research. That discovery ended any question of guilt. The Oats twins were arrested that same morning. Phoebe didn't resist. She even tidied her dress before the handcuffs were fastened. Wilbert bowed his head like a man leaving church. As they were led away, they asked only one thing: that their notebooks be returned to them in prison. When the story broke, it ripped through Oregon like wildfire. Newspapers called them the incestuous scientists, the Crater Lake monsters, and the twins of terror. But those who knew them, the merchants, the townsfolk, couldn't reconcile those headlines with the quiet, polite pair who once bought sugar and flour every week. The trial began that autumn. The courthouse overflowed with onlookers. Reporters traveled from San Francisco and Seattle just to catch a glimpse of the siblings who'd turned science into savagery. When questioned, Wilbert spoke with the tone of a lecturer. He described his children as examples of genetic consequence. Phoebe, sitting beside him, nodded serenely. Neither expressed remorse. Love, she told the courtroom, is simply nature reflecting on itself. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict. As the sentence was read, life imprisonment for both, Phoebe smiled faintly, as though satisfied with the verdict. Wilbert whispered something to her, and though no one heard the words, several witnesses swore they spoke in perfect unison. The children who survived were taken into medical care. The oldest could barely walk. The youngest didn't know how to speak. The doctors called it the most disturbing case of human conditioning they'd ever seen. And when the verdict was sealed, the Oats property was left to rot. But the story wasn't finished yet, because even after the house burned to the ground, the legend refused to die. After the trial, the Oats property stood empty, a skeleton of timber and silence. The neighbors swore the forest grew darker around it, that the pines leaned inward as if trying to hide what had happened there. Nobody wanted the land, not even for free. By 1920, the house was gone. Some said lightning struck it during a storm. Others whispered that the sheriff himself ordered it burned. But those who lived closest claimed something else, that on a moonless night, flames rose from the ground without warning, swallowing the building in minutes. No one saw who lit the fire. Some claimed they heard faint laughter in the wind as it burned. Nothing grew there for years. The soil turned gray, the trees twisted and stunted. Hunters who ventured too close came back pale, saying they'd heard the echo of children crying beneath the earth. The locals learned to avoid the place entirely, referring to it only as the Ridge. Phoebe and Wilbert Oats lived out the rest of their days behind prison walls. Phoebe died first in 1934, peacefully, in her sleep, still insisting her work had been for the good of mankind. Wilbert lasted longer, until 1951. Prison guards said he rarely spoke, except when he thought he heard someone walking in step with him. "She's here," he would whisper. "She's never far." He died smiling. The surviving Oats children, what remained of them, were sent to institutions across the state. A few lived into adulthood, though living might not be the right word. One spent her life in a wheelchair, her spine curved like a question mark. Another, the healthiest of the four, spent years drawing faces that looked eerily alike, pairs of eyes, pairs of smiles, over and over again. None of them ever spoke their parents' names. The legend of the Oats twins became the kind of story told around campfires and logging camps. Some said the twins' obsession had poisoned the soil itself. Others swore their spirits still roamed the woods, searching for their unfinished work. But the older residents of Crater Lake said something simpler and far more chilling. The forest remembers. And maybe it does. Even now, hikers who stray too close to the site sometimes report hearing a rhythmic tapping, like small fingers against wood. Others describe soft laughter echoing between the trees, or the faint lullaby of two voices humming in perfect unison. There are no graves for the Oats twins. Their remains were cremated, their ashes scattered somewhere near the Columbia River. But locals say the wind never carried them far enough. Because on still nights, When fog creeps down from the mountain and the pines stand whispering, the land where their house once stood feels alive, as if it's still breathing, still watching. And maybe that's the true curse of the Oats twins. They proved that horror doesn't always come from ghosts or monsters in the dark. Sometimes it comes from people who believe they're doing something righteous. People who look at evil and call it progress. The wind over Crater Lake still carries a strange quiet. If you ever stand there alone, surrounded by pine and fog, you'll feel it. That uneasy stillness that presses on your chest, like the forest itself is holding its breath. Maybe it's just the weight of history. Or maybe some places never forget. The story of Phoebe and Wilbert Oates isn't just about madness. It's about how isolation twists the mind, how obsession can masquerade as purpose, and how love, when warped by ego, can become something monstrous. They sought to create perfection, and in doing so, erased every trace of humanity they ever had. It's easy to look back and call them evil. But what if their story is a mirror? A reflection of what happens when we let curiosity, pride, or grief go unchecked. How far would any of us go, alone in the wilderness, with no one left to tell us no? The Oats twins believed they were building a legacy. Instead, they left behind a warning. So, if you ever find yourself hiking near the old ridge where their house once stood, and you hear a faint tapping from beneath the earth, don't stop to listen. Just keep walking. Because some stories
aren't meant to be repeated.
Headphone, if this story gave you chills, hit that like button so more people can discover these forgotten tales. Tell me in the comments, would you ever explore a place with a history like this? And if you're new here, subscribe. Because next time, we're diving into another dark corner of history, where truth sounds stranger than any ghost story.